11:47 at night, and the 28th floor of Emerson Tower was the only lit square in a dark skyline. Kate Emerson sat behind 3 monitors, face unreadable. For assistants in 2 years. 3 corporate therapists. 2 acting officers before she ever set foot in Charlotte. Nobody stayed. Nobody got close. No one could reach the billionaire's daughter. A cleaning cart will squeak to a stop outside her door. 2 knocks. Nobody knocked on her door at midnight. Before you keep going, what do you think finally got through to her? Hold that thought. It might not be what you expect. Emerson Tower sat at the center of uptown Charlotte, glass and steel rising over Tryon Street. 40 stories of green, tinted windows that caught the last light off the skyline every evening before the city went dark around it. Everyone who worked there knew the 28th floor by a different name, the Freeze. Not because it was cold, because nothing survived up there long. Kate Emerson ran the Charlotte branch of Emerson Holdings with a kind of efficiency that left no room for anyone to get comfortable. Her emails never used first names. Per my last email, please advise by end of day. She had the highest staff turnover of any office in the company, for assistants gone in 2 years, and by now she had stopped noticing the pattern or had decided it wasn't worth noticing. Adam Perry had been cleaning that floor for 2 years. Longest tenure of any janitor who'd worked it, longer than most of her assistants had lasted combined. He came through at 10 most nights, when the building had mostly cleared out and the hallway lights dimmed to their after-hours setting. But Kate was always still there, still at her desk, still working through whatever the day hadn't finished. He knocked twice, let himself in, emptied the trash, wiped the surfaces, straightened the chairs, and said nothing beyond evening on his way in and evening on his way out. She never looked up from her screen. It was the only routine on that floor that hadn't changed since the day she arrived 4 years earlier. One night he noticed her coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched, still full to the rim, a thin skin already forming across the surface. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't ask if she wanted a fresh cup or offer to run downstairs to the machine in the break room. The next evening, he brought his own thermos from home, filled before his shift started, and set it outside her door before he let himself into work. No note, no name, nothing that asked her to acknowledge it. In the morning, the front desk found it sitting by the elevator bank, empty, rinsed clean, set down like it had never been anything but hers to use. She never mentioned it to him, but she noticed. Kate was used to people wanting something from her, a signature, a favor, an introduction to her father, a foot in the door of a company that could make or end a career with one email. This man never asked for anything, not once, not even eye contact beyond what politeness required. She started noticing other things too, small things she wouldn't have registered a year earlier. The hinge on the conference room door that had been squeaking for a month, fixed without a work order ever crossing her desk. The wobble in the side table by the window, gone overnight. The hallway bulb near the elevator replaced 2 days before it would have burned out completely, like someone had done the math on its lifespan and beaten the clock. Paul Brennan watched all of it from a security monitor down the hall, 3 floors below, face still as glass. He had been vice president of operations for the Charlotte branch for 5 years, longer than Kate had run the place, longer than anyone else currently on staff. He did not like the idea of anyone getting close to her for long, not because he cared who she trusted, but because trust in the wrong direction had a way of asking questions he didn't want answered. He filed the observation away in the back of his mind, the way he filed most things that might become useful later, and said nothing. Not yet. Janet Lowell handled quarterly maintenance files from an office 2 doors down from Paul's, and one slow Thursday afternoon, she pulled Adam Perry's employee record out of habit more than need, thinking she might put together a small commendation for the building's next staff newsletter. 2 years on staff. Not a single complaint filed against him in that whole stretch. The only name on the entire maintenance roster she could say that about with certainty. Curious in the idle way people get curious about coworkers they've never really talked to. She typed his full name into a search bar, expecting nothing more than a social media profile or an old high school mention. What came back stopped her hand on the mouse. A trade journal from 2019, Structural Engineering magazine, a feature spread on the Meridian Tower project in Atlanta, one of the most technically demanding vertical builds completed that decade, 52 stories on a footprint half the size engineers usually wanted for that height. Led structural engineer Adam J. Perry. The photograph showed him younger by maybe 5 years, in a gray suit, standing in front of a wall of blueprints with the kind of half-smile that belonged to a man who knew precisely what he'd built and didn't need to say so. She sat with the laptop open a long time, scrolling back up to the photo, then down to the byline. Same face, just fewer lines around the eyes. The man who had designed the load-bearing skeleton of a 52-story tower was mopping the floors of this one, 40 stories shorter, and had been for 2 years without a single person in that building thinking to ask why. Janet didn't tell anyone, not that day, not that week. She'd been at Emerson Tower 12 years, long enough to know exactly how Paul operated when he found leverage on somebody, long enough to remember the maintenance supervisor 2 years back, who'd been quietly pushed out after Paul learned about a prior bankruptcy filing and used it in a performance review that had nothing to do with performance. She was 2 years from a pension she could not afford to lose over information that wasn't hers to spend carelessly. So she printed the article, folded it once, and closed the tab. She would wait for a reason good enough to justify what she did with it. That same week, the routine between Adam and Kate shifted, just barely. He set the thermos down outside her door the way he always did, and for once she opened the door before he'd even let go of the handle, catching him mid-motion in the hallway light. They stood there facing each other, closer than the doorway usually allowed for. She looked down at the thermos, then back up at him. "You don't have to do that," she said, not unkindly, more like she was testing whether he'd stop if she gave him the opening. "I know," he said, and rolled the cart past her into the room without waiting for permission he hadn't been asking for. She stood in the doorway 3 full seconds longer than the moment required before she finally shut the door behind her, longer than she had given anyone and longer than she could remember. Janet slid the printed article into a manila folder and then into a locked drawer in her desk, the one she reserved for things that weren't ready to be known yet. She had carried plenty of secrets through that building over 12 years. This one felt different. This one had the shape of something that could rearrange the entire floor plan of Kate Emerson's life, if it ever surfaced the right way, at the right time, in front of the right person. If Adam's hidden past is starting to feel like a fuse that's already lit, you're reading it right, but the fire won't start where you expect it to. The weeks that followed settled into something steadier, something almost domestic in its repetition. The thermos every night, filled with the same dark roast, set outside the door before Adam ever knocked. 2 knocks, then through, then the same low murmur of evening exchanged on his way in. Kate started drinking all of it instead of leaving half to go cold the way she once had. And some nights, she left a real ceramic mug on her desk instead of the paper cup from the break room, as if she wanted him to know she'd noticed the difference, without ever having to say the words out loud where either of them would have to acknowledge them. Adam noticed things too, in his own quiet way. Kate ate the same boxed salad alone at her desk every single night, the plastic container from the same grocery chain, never anything delivered, never anyone joining her. She never took a personal call that he overheard in 2 years of emptying that trash can. No photographs anywhere in the office, not on the desk, not on the shelf behind her, not on the wall where framed certificates usually hung in offices that size. Just one picture frame, face down in the bottom drawer of her desk, which he only knew about because he replaced that drawer's liner once a week and had to move the frame aside to do it. He never turned it over. It wasn't his to turn, and some instinct told him that leaving it exactly as he found it mattered more than curiosity did. Paul called Janet into his office that Tuesday morning, framing the meeting as routine housekeeping, a request to optimize the maintenance rotation schedule across the building's 4 zones. What he actually wanted, buried under 2 sentences of policy language, was Adam off the 28th floor entirely. "He's been on the same floor too long," Paul said, tapping a pen against the desk in a rhythm that meant he'd already decided the outcome before the meeting started. "Rotate him somewhere else, ground floor, loading dock, wherever there's an opening." Janet asked why that particular assignment mattered enough to warrant a special conversation instead of the usual quarterly review. Paul didn't answer the question directly. He said policy required 30 days written notice for a schedule change affecting an employee's primary floor assignment, and Janet, without missing a beat, told him she'd need to double-check the current employee handbook language before processing anything, buying herself 30 days she didn't yet know how she'd use, but knew instinctively she needed. That night Adam finished his round on the 28th floor while Kate stood at the window instead of at her desk, looking down at the grid of Charlotte's streets instead of at her 3 monitors. He'd never seen her stand there before. She always worked until the building's automated lights started their slow dim around midnight. She spoke first, which she never did. "The city looks different from up here at night," she said, not really to him, more to the glass itself, like she was thinking out loud, and he happened to be in the room. Adam paused with a trash bag half tied in his hand, looked out at the same skyline from a lower angle than she was seeing it. "It looks different from down there too," he said. Neither of them added anything else to it. He finished tying off the bag and moved on to the next bin. She sat back down at her desk, but didn't open her laptop right away, just sat with the quiet a while longer than the workload in front of her strictly required. Nothing between them had turned into conversation. Not really. Not in the way two people who wanted to know each other usually talked. No questions about where the other one grew up. No exchanged first impressions. Nothing beyond what the badge on his uniform and the nameplate on her door already said about who they were supposed to be to one another. But something was closing between them, an inch a night, the kind of distance that doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment, only with the sudden, quiet realization much later that it's gone. Paul didn't wait out the 30 days Janet had bought. He manufactured a shortcut instead, an anonymous complaint routed through the tenant services portal about unauthorized personal items being left in secured executive work areas, meaning the thermos Adam had been leaving outside Kate's door most nights for weeks. He walked the complaint straight to HR himself, in person, and requested a formal written warning be issued that same day. Adam signed it in the break room without argument, without asking who had filed it, because he understood there was no version of that question that would get him an honest answer from anyone standing between him and the paperwork. Janet knew the complaint was manufactured before she'd finished reading the second line. Nobody worked that hallway at that hour except Kate, and Kate certainly hadn't filed a complaint against the one person on staff who never once caused her trouble. Janet confronted Paul privately, in the stairwell where the cameras had a known blind spot, a fact everyone on the maintenance staff had long since learned. "Who filed this?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "Anonymous complaints don't require disclosure under company policy," he said, and that was the entirety of the conversation, delivered with the same flat certainty he used for every conversation he didn't intend to lose. She understood then, walking back to her office, that Paul wasn't managing operations at all. He was clearing a path, methodically, towards something she still couldn't fully see the shape of. That night Adam still brought the thermos, filled the same as always, but he left it sitting in the cart instead of at the door, unsure now whether even that small unspoken habit was safe to keep after the warning sitting folded in his back pocket. Kate heard the cart wheels before she heard the knock and opened the door first, something she had never once done in 2 years of this routine. She saw the thermos still sitting in the cart's cup holder, not where it usually waited on the floor by her door, and looked at him for an explanation he didn't offer and didn't seem inclined to. "Bring it inside," she said. Not a command, not the tone she used with vendors or junior staff. Something closer to a request, maybe even closer to an apology for whatever had made him stop. He carried it in and set it on the corner of her desk, careful not to disturb the stack of documents beside it, then went back to work on the room like any other night, emptying bins, straightening chairs, saying nothing about the warning at all. It was the first time in years Kate had invited anyone into that room using her own words instead of a scheduled meeting logged by an assistant. Adam understood the weight of it, even though neither of them said so out loud, and he carried that understanding with him the rest of the shift, quieter than usual, more careful with every small task in the room. Paul reviewed the hallway camera footage himself the next morning, coffee in hand, watching Adam step into her office on a loop 3 times before he was satisfied. He noted the timestamp in a private file he kept on his own laptop, separate from anything that would show up in a company audit. The way a man keeps receipts for something he isn't ready to use yet, but doesn't want to lose track of either. By the end of that shift, Janet sat alone at her desk with the folder open again, the photograph of a younger Adam staring back up at her under the desk lamp's narrow light. 30 days were almost up, and she understood with a kind of dread that Paul wasn't going to wait for the clock to finish running. If she didn't decide soon what to do with what she knew, the decision would very likely be made for her, and not in a direction she wanted. The 30-day countdown is about to run out, and what happens next isn't the confrontation you're picturing. Kate had a bad night 2 days later, the kind that started before she even got to the office. A call from New York that morning, her father's voice flat and procedural on the line, informing her that the board had requested a formal performance review of the Charlotte branch's operating margins for the past 2 quarters. He spoke to her the way he spoke to any regional director on a routine call, not like a father checking in on his only child, like a line item that needed explaining. She said what needed saying, professional and clipped, and hung up, and sat in the dark of her office a long while afterward, lights off, chair turned fully toward the window instead of her screens. Adam came through at 10, knocked twice out of habit, got no answer, and opened the door slowly anyway, the way he'd learned to over 2 years of reading the silence correctly more often than not. Kate sat at her desk in the dark, face turned toward the glass, shoulders drawn in a way he'd never seen from her before. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't ask what was wrong. Didn't offer the kind of hollow concern that would have required her to perform a response she didn't have in her that night. He worked the room the way he always worked it, emptied the bins, wiped down the side table, straightened the visitor chairs along the wall, all of it by feel and years of habit, letting the room stay dark because some instinct told him that was exactly what she needed right then, someone present who wasn't asking anything of her at all. She never turned around, not once, but she heard every small sound of him moving through the room, and something in her chest loosened at the simple, unfamiliar proof that a person could be in a room with her and want nothing from her in return. As he reached the door to leave, mostly finished, she spoke without turning around. "The frame in the drawer," she said. "It's my mother." A long pause followed, long enough that he wondered if she wanted him to say something specific back, or nothing at all. He didn't ask anything else, didn't push toward the rest of a story that clearly went somewhere heavier than 4 words could carry. "She must have been something," he said. Then he pulled the door shut behind him, quiet, careful with the latch the way he was careful with everything in that room. It was the first time in 4 years that Kate had told anyone in that building something true and unscripted about herself, without being asked, without it being extracted through a performance review or a company retreat exercise designed to build trust she'd never once felt in that building. Not because he'd asked, because he hadn't. The next morning, the new junior assistant on the floor noticed the frame on Kate's desk had been turned face up for the first time anyone on staff could remember seeing it. She didn't understand what it meant, mentioned it only in passing to a coworker as a strange little detail. Janet, passing through the hallway on her way to the supply closet, saw it through the open door and stopped mid-step, one hand still on the doorframe. She knew that photograph. She'd stood next to the woman in it, at more than one charity gala 20 years back. And she understood, in the space of a few seconds standing frozen in that hallway, exactly what had shifted on that floor, even if she couldn't yet explain to herself how a janitor with a thermos had gotten further in 2 years than 4 professional therapists had managed in the same amount of time. Paul pushed harder that week, sensing perhaps that his window was closing faster than he'd planned for. He proposed outsourcing the building's entire maintenance operation to an outside contractor, presented to the board as a cost-saving measure with detailed projections attached, a company that on paper had no connection to him whatsoever, but whose registered agent, when Janet pulled the state filing out of simple stubborn curiosity, traced back to an address 2 blocks from Paul's own condominium building. The plan, if approved, would eliminate every in-house maintenance position at Emerson Tower within 60 days, Adams included, replaced by contract labor billed through the very company Paul had quietly created. Adam was assigned that week to clear out storage room B2 in the basement, boxes of financial and vendor records 5 years old and older that needed to be cataloged before an off-site archive company hauled them away. A carton slipped off a top shelf as he reached for the one beside it, spilled its contents across the concrete floor in a fan of loose paper, and as he knelt to gather everything back together, he saw what was actually printed on the pages in his hands. Maintenance and renovation contracts stretching back 3, for years, each one signed by Paul Brennan personally, each one routed through the same 3 vendor names in rotation, same pricing structure down to the dollar, same notary stamp, appearing again and again like a signature more consistent than any of the supposedly independent vendors' own paperwork. Adam didn't understand the full financial shape of what he was looking at. But he understood repetition when he saw it laid out in front of him, the same way he used to spot a stress pattern in a blueprint before a junior engineer on his old team ever caught it. He photographed a dozen of the pages on his phone, no plan yet for what he'd do with the images, just an old instinct refusing to let the pattern disappear quietly back into a cardboard box marked for disposal. He didn't take any of it to Kate. There was no version of their routine, built over 2 years on careful silence about exactly this kind of thing, where that conversation made sense to start. Some part of him understood clearly that it wasn't his place to raise it with her directly, not when neither of them had ever once discussed what either of them actually did for a living beyond the roles the building assigned them. He brought it instead to Janet, the only person in that building who had ever treated him like more than a uniform pushing a cart down a hallway. Janet looked at the photographs on his phone screen and went pale in a way Adam hadn't expected from a woman who'd worked 12 years in corporate facilities management and thought she'd seen most of what a building could hide. She opened her own locked drawer and pulled out 2 years of invoices, vendor registrations, and printed email chains she'd been quietly gathering without ever having quite enough in one place to act on any of it. Adam's photographs were the missing piece, physical proof to match a pattern she'd only ever been able to guess at from a distance. He's been stealing from her for 4 years, Janet said, mostly to herself, staring at the spread of documents across her desk, and keeping her isolated enough the whole time that she'd never once think to look closely at any of it. That night Adam worked the 28th floor while Kate read through a stack of quarterly documents at her desk, eyes tired in a way that showed even from across the room. The thermos sat open beside her, half finished. She looked up when he came in, not the usual sideways glance, but something straighter, more direct than he'd gotten from her before. "You've been here 2 years," she said. Not really a question. He nodded once, kept working. "Why do you stay?" she asked, setting her pen down like she actually wanted to hear the answer instead of just filling silence. "Same reason anyone stays anywhere," he said. "It feels right." Neither of them said anything else after that. But the answer sat in the room a long time after he'd finished and gone, longer than either of them would have admitted out loud. Janet took everything she had to Emerson Holdings' internal legal counsel in New York directly, bypassing Paul's office entirely. Photographs from the basement, the invoices, the vendor filings, all organized into a folder with a summary memo on top laying out the pattern plainly. The paperwork showed a single registered agent shared across 3 supposedly independent shell companies, one of them traceable, through a chain of business filings that took her most of a weekend to untangle, straight back to Paul Brennan's own name on an incorporation document from 6 years earlier. Paul found out something was wrong when a legal team email landed in his inbox, copied to him almost as an afterthought, requesting clarification on several of Charlotte's maintenance contracts. He moved fast. He called an emergency meeting with Kate that same afternoon and tried to get ahead of the story, framing Janet as a disgruntled employee coasting toward a retirement she resented having to wait for, and framing Adam as a maintenance worker exhibiting a pattern of concerning behavior. Kate listened to the entire pitch with the same flat, unreadable expression she gave any quarterly report crossing her desk. But something underneath the surface had changed. For the first time in 4 years running that office, she didn't accept his version as fact on the first telling. She asked to see the original contract files themselves, not summaries. Paul hesitated, half a second, no more than that, but it was enough, and she caught it. She asked again, quieter this time, harder underneath the quiet. The original files. Now, Paul couldn't produce them without exposing the exact pattern Janet had already laid out for New York. He pivoted instead, pushed hard for Adam's immediate termination on the grounds of a security breach, hoping to make the conversation about anything other than the paperwork he couldn't show her. Kate had Janet brought up to the office instead. Janet arrived steady, unhurried, a full physical copy of everything under her arm, and laid it all out across the conference table without waiting to be asked twice. 4 years of quietly redirected maintenance contracts, an estimated $2.1 million in inflated costs routed through companies that existed only on paper. Kate looked at Paul for a long moment. No raised voice, no scene. "Get out of my building," she said. He tried to argue, started a sentence about context and everything he'd built for the company over 5 years. She picked up the phone and called building security instead of letting him finish. He left within the hour, escorted, badge deactivated before he reached the lobby. Adam wasn't in the room for any of it. He was 2 floors down, finishing his shift, unaware the photographs he'd handed to Janet 3 days earlier had already reached New York and made their way back down as a formal investigation. He only knew he'd given her something that felt important at the time. He didn't yet know what it had actually done, or who it had protected. Kate sat alone in her office after Paul was gone, Janet still standing across the table. Kate looked at her, not the look of a chief operating officer studying a completed report, but something closer to the look of a 16-year-old girl who had lost her mother and never quite finished grieving, because nobody around her had ever given her the room to. "Your mother would have done exactly the same thing," Janet said, gently. Kate didn't answer, but she didn't ask Janet to leave the room either. 2 days after the confrontation, Paul Brennan was formally suspended pending investigation, his personnel file and a growing stack of financial records handed over to internal counsel and, soon after, referred to federal investigators given the scale of the fraud involved. The 28th floor felt quieter in the days that followed, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the freeze anyone on staff would have recognized from the past 4 years. Just still, the way a room feels after a storm is actually passed instead of just paused. Adam arrived for his shift that Thursday, knocked twice out of habit before he'd even fully processed what he was about to see. Kate opened the door before he'd finished the second knock, standing there in the doorway instead of calling him in from behind her desk the way she always had. She stepped aside without a word, held the door for him instead of leaving it to close on its own weight. On her desk sat 2 mugs instead of 1, the second already poured and cooling slightly at the edge closest to the visitor chair. She worked at her laptop while he cleaned, and the mug she'd filled for him sat waiting on the side table by the window, exactly where the thermos used to sit outside the door. He stopped when he noticed it, looked over at her. She didn't look up from her screen. He drank from it before he went back to emptying the bins, and neither of them said thank you out loud. It wasn't necessary between them anymore. Janet caught him in the hallway after his shift ended that night, waiting near the elevator bank like she'd planned the timing. She told him Paul had been formally suspended, that the photographs he'd taken in the basement had mattered more to the outcome than he probably realized standing in that storage room at the time. Adam nodded, didn't ask for further details about the investigation or what came next for any of them. Janet studied his face a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. "You know," she said, "Meridian Tower is still standing, still one of the tallest buildings in that part of Atlanta." He stopped walking toward the elevator. It was the first time anyone in that building had spoken his past out loud directly to his face, without him having to explain or deflect or change the subject the way he usually managed to. He didn't deny any of it. "That was a long time ago," he said, quieter than usual. "Good work doesn't expire," she said back, and let him go without pushing further. That weekend, at home in the small rental house he and Sam had lived in since the move, Adam and his son sat on the living room floor building a suspension bridge model together, pieces of balsa wood and thin metal cables spread across the carpet between them. Sam asked, not looking up from the beam he was gluing into place, if his dad had had a good day. Adam looked at his son for a moment, something loosening behind his eyes that hadn't been there in a long while. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "I think I did." Sam grinned without looking up and clipped another beam into place along the deck of the model. Late afternoon light came through the front window and settled warm across both of them and the half-built bridge between them. Back at the tower that same evening, Kate left her office before 8 o'clock for the first time in 4 years anyone on staff could remember. The new assistant watched her step into the elevator from the front desk, glanced at the wall clock out of pure habit, 7:43, and had a text sent to a coworker before the elevator doors had even finished closing. "You're not going to believe this." The next stretch answers a question you've probably been sitting with. What does someone like Kate actually do with a second chance at trusting somebody? Don Emerson flew down from New York within the week, not for the previously scheduled board review, but specifically because of what had landed on his desk regarding Paul Brennan and the scale of what he'd been running under the Charlotte branch's nose for years. He met Kate in her office on the 28th floor and told her, in the same measured tone he used for every conversation about the business, that she'd handled the whole situation exactly right, quick and clean, and without unnecessary exposure for the company. She didn't want the professional compliment. Not really, not the way he meant it. She asked instead, cutting straight past it. Did you know he was the only one who stayed? Don didn't understand who she meant, and his confusion showed plainly on his face. She didn't explain further, didn't feel the need to. But he noticed something in his daughter's expression he hadn't seen there in years, something looser around the eyes, even without understanding its shape or its cause. Before he left the building that afternoon, Don stopped by Janet's office on the way to the elevator, an old habit from years back when his late wife used to stop there too. Janet had known her from years of shared charity board work, long before any of this had started. She told him plainly, without softening it for him. "She's been alone for 16 years, Don," she said. Someone finally stuck around long enough for her to actually notice it. He said nothing for a long moment, just stood in her doorway with his hands in his coat pockets. It was the kind of silence that meant he'd heard every word of it. The internal investigation closed within 2 more weeks. Paul Brennan was formally terminated. His personnel file referred to federal authorities on wire fraud charges given the scale of money involved, and the Charlotte Board's Operations Committee was restructured under new oversight brought in from the New York office. None of it involved Adam directly in any official capacity. He kept cleaning the 28th floor at 10 o'clock every night. Same as always. Same routine, same 2 knocks. Kate finally read the rest of the file Janet had been keeping. The trade magazine article, the photograph of Adam Younger, in a gray suit, standing in front of a wall of blueprints with a half-smile that belonged to a man who knew exactly what he'd built. She wasn't shocked in the dramatic way people describe being shocked. It was closer to watching a structure she'd been staring at for months finally line up into a shape she could recognize. The conference room hinge fixed without a work order, the side table leveled to the millimeter, the hallway bulb replaced 2 days before it would have failed on its own. He hadn't been hiding any of it from her, not really. He had simply never been asked, and some quiet part of her understood now that not asking had somehow become its own kind of gift, the only gift anyone had given her in years that didn't come with a price attached. That evening, Kate left the building at 6 o'clock, the earliest she'd left in 4 years, and walked down Tryon Street instead of calling a car the way she normally did. She looked at Charlotte from ground level for the first time in longer than she could remember, the buildings tall around her instead of stretched out beneath her from 28 floors up. It looks different from down here too, she thought, almost smiling to herself on the sidewalk, using someone else's words for the first time in longer than she could remember doing anything that wasn't strictly hers. 3 months later, Emerson Tower ran differently than it had in years. Staff turnover on the 28th floor had dropped to nearly nothing. Nobody called it the freeze anymore, not even in the joking way people used to when they thought Kate couldn't hear them. She was still demanding in meetings, still sharp with numbers and deadlines the way she'd always been. But her emails had started using first names, a small shift the whole office had noticed within the first 2 weeks without anyone quite mentioning it out loud to each other. Adam still worked the night shift, still cleaned the same floor at the same hour every night. He never applied for a position in the company's engineering division, even after 2 people in facilities quietly mentioned there might be an opening worth his background. Kate never offered him one either, never once brought it up across all their evenings together. Both of them understood, without ever needing to say it directly, that whatever had grown between them over 2 years hadn't grown out of a job title or a promotion, and putting one on it now would only shrink something that had gotten large in its own quiet way down to something smaller and easier to categorize than it actually was. One Sunday afternoon, Kate showed up at Adam's front door unannounced, something she'd never done in all the months since Paul left. Sam answered before his father could get to the door, looked up at her with open curiosity instead of caution. She crouched down to his eye level on the front step. "I heard you build bridges," she said. Sam glanced back over his shoulder at his father standing in the hallway, then back at her, deciding something quickly the way kids do. "Want to see?" he asked, and led her by the hand into the living room, where the suspension bridge model sat on the coffee table, still unfinished, 2 beams missing from the far end where they'd left off the week before. Sam handed her one of the beams without asking if she wanted to help. She fitted into place, slightly crooked, glue smearing a little on her fingers. He reached over and straightened it for her without being asked, patient about the correction the way his father was patient about most things in that house. Adam stood in the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, one for her, one for himself, watching the 2 of them work on the bridge together. This time, He was the one carrying the coffee across the room to her. Kate took the mug from his hand when he reached her side. Their fingers touched for a second at the handle, then let go, neither of them making anything of it out loud. Sam kept working on the bridge, too absorbed in getting the last beam to sit level to notice either of them standing there. Late afternoon lights spread through the front window and settled across the unfinished model on the table, catching the thin metal cables and turning them gold for a moment before the light shifted again. Kate looked at Adam over the rim of her mug. Not at the janitor who emptied her trash can every night for 2 years, not at the engineer whose name had once appeared in a trade magazine she'd never have found on her own, just at the man who had knocked twice on her door every single night, without once asking her to open it for him. Adam looked back at her the same way. Not at the billionaire's daughter whose name was on half the buildings in this part of the state, not at the chief operating officer who signed off on his paycheck without ever once seeing his face on paper, just at the woman who had finally, after everything, turned the photograph in her drawer face up. Outside the window, Charlotte sat quiet in the late afternoon light, and from ground level, from inside a small rental house with a half-finished bridge on the coffee table, it looked almost exactly the same as it had from the 28th floor of Emerson Tower, if either of them had still needed to look at it from that far away to understand what they were seeing. Neither of them had been reaching. They had just stopped walking away.